Did you know that that Moses never actually once used the word Judaism? And like Jesus never told his followers to start a new religion called Christianity.
Yeah, I know it sounds totally counterintuitive, but, if you look at the historical record, those labels just didn't exist during their lifetimes. They were adopted, long after those figures were gone.
Right, which is wild to think about. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking into a stack of academic sources that argue the names of the world's biggest religions are actually, well, they're basically just historical nicknames.
Exactly.
We're exploring summaries and texts on comparative religion from Al-Azhar University. It's one of the oldest and most prestigious centers of Islamic learning in the world, and they have this highly specific, really rigorous framework for analyzing the origins of faith, the hidden depths of the words we use to describe it, and how ancient sacred texts survived or didn't survive thousands of years of history.
But before we go any further, it's probably worth noting our mission for today. We are basically acting as your guides to unpack the arguments and perspectives presented in these specific academic sources.
Right, we're just laying out the information.
Yeah, we're laying out how this particular field of Islamic academic scholarship analyzes the history of world religions. We're doing this impartially and, without endorsing any specific theological viewpoints.
Exactly. So, to understand how religions evolved over time, we really have to start at the very beginning. Like, where did the concept of religion even come from? The sources contrast the typical Western sociological theories with the Islamic theological view, and, the difference is absolute.
It really is night and day. Sociological and anthropological scholars, they often argue that religion is a human invention, right? Like it was born out of early humanity's fear of natural forces.
Like being terrified of lightning or something?
Yeah, exactly. Early humans were terrified of lightning or droughts, so they invented a thunder god or a rain god just to appease those forces. And then over time, that evolved into a social contract to keep growing tribes in line. Or maybe it was just a tool invented by elites to maintain power.
So the sociological view kind of treats early religion like a primitive coping mechanism. It's like a psychological band-aid for things we couldn't explain. To use an analogy, it's like saying humans invented an umbrella because they were scared of the rain.
That's a great way to look at it.
But the Islamic view, according to our sources from Al-Azhar, treats it more like a manufacturer's user manual.
Yeah.
It wasn't invented to cope with the world. It was provided so we'd actually know how to operate within it. Like the weatherman just handed them the umbrella.
Right, yeah. The Islamic scholars completely reject that sociological origin theory. From their theological perspective, religion didn't slowly evolve from fear. It started with the very first human, Adam.
Wow, okay.
And the texts emphasize that in Islamic belief, Adam wasn't just, a man wandering around a primitive earth figuring things out. He was a prophet who received direct divine revelation from day one.
But wait, let me push back on that for a second. If Adam was the first and the only man for a while, who exactly is he a messenger to? Just his immediate family. How does that even constitute being a prophet?
It's a fair question. In Islamic theology, being a prophet doesn't necessarily mean you are preaching to a massive nation or an entire empire. Prophethood can simply mean receiving divine instruction to guide oneself and one's immediate dependents.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's about establishing the absolute baseline of human morality from the very beginning, so that humanity, literally never exists without a moral compass.
And the sources point to the story of Cain and Abel, Adam's sons, as the prime evidence for this, right?
Exactly. The Al-Azhar texts point out that when Cain and Abel offered sacrifices to God, they already knew what a sacrifice was. They knew what was lawful and unlawful. They already knew about the concepts of heaven and hell and divine accounting.
So they didn't just invent the concept of a sacrifice out of thin air. They were already operating under a system.
Precisely. The fact that they were held accountable implies that a predefined set of divine laws was already in place and had been communicated to them. You can't have a test without a syllabus. So the Islamic academic view is that humanity has never actually been without divine guidance.
Okay, so if humanity has had this user manual since the very first day, how did they describe it? Because looking at the sources, the Arabic vocabulary used for faith reveals a massive amount about how this tradition views humanity's relationship with the divine.
Oh, absolutely. Arabic is a root-based language, so a single word carries layers of interconnected historical meanings. The overarching Arabic word for religion is deen.
Deen, right.
And the sources break down deen into a few core concepts. First, it means reward or punishment. like a system of accounting. It also means habit or custom, but the primary all-encompassing meaning is obedience and submission.
Meaning it's not just a private set of beliefs you hold in your heart or your head?
No, not at all. It implies a comprehensive binding system between a ruler and a subject. It's a complete way of life based on obedience to a higher authority.
The text then contrasts deen with two other Arabic words, which I found fascinating, Milla and Nihla. So Milla refers to the practical, lived application or the path of a religion. The sources say it's actually often associated with the prophet Abraham in the Quran.
Right.
And then Nihla implies a mere claim or a sect, and it's almost always used to describe human-made doctrines or fabrications.
Yeah, Nihla carries this really heavy connotation of something invented or adopted by choice, entirely separate from anything divinely mandated.
So to use another analogy, if deen is the ultimate overarching constitution of a country, Milla is the daily civil law that people actually interact with and practice on the ground.
I like that, yeah.
And Nihla would be like a rogue breakaway state that just made up its own rules entirely.
That framing aligns perfectly with how these scholars categorize belief systems.
But let me play devil's advocate here. If the word deen just means obedience or a comprehensive system, couldn't, like capitalism or a purely secular lifestyle, or even worshiping a literal statue, technically be considered a deen linguistically? Because you are still submitting to a system of rules and habits.
Linguistically speaking, yes. Any system of obedience, even a completely secular or idolatrous one, is technically a deen. If you submit entirely to your own desires, the linguistic framework of Arabic actually says that is your deen.
Wow. Okay.
However, the Al-Azhar texts are very careful to clarify that in Islamic theology, true deen, the accepted deen, is restricted solely to the uncorrupted submission to the one creator.
Right. So if that core idea of submission is timeless and universal, it raises a massive question about the labels we use today. How did we end up with all these specific names for different religions? The sources argue that the modern names of major faiths are actually human historical constructs, not divine titles.
Yeah, the scholars point out that the terms Judaism and Christianity were never actually preached by Moses or Jesus. You won't find Moses telling his followers to practice Judaism, and you definitely won't find Jesus telling his disciples to start Christianity.
It's basically like finding out your favorite band didn't actually name themselves. Like the fans just gave them a nickname decades later, and it stuck.
That's a really good comparison, and the etymology in the sources backs that up perfectly. If you look at the term Judaism, or Yahud in Arabic, it stems from a couple of earthly origins.
Okay.
It might come from Judah, who is just one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Or it stems from an Arabic and Hebrew linguistic root meaning to return or repent, which references a specific historical moment when the Israelites repented to God.
And what about Christianity? Where does that come from?
The term for Christianity, Masihiyya or Nasara, also has entirely earthly origins. It either comes from the geographical town of Nazareth, where Jesus was from, or from the Arabic word ansar, which means helpers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it refers to the historical moment when the disciples declared, "We are the helpers of God."
So they are descriptive titles, or geographic titles, or historical titles, but not divine mandates. Meanwhile, the sources emphasize that the Quran uses the exact same term, Islam, meaning submission for all the prophets. Abraham, Moses, Jesus, they're all described as practicing Islam.
Right, because to these scholars, it is all one continuous deen. The core message never changed, only the practical millah, the specific laws for specific times, changed.
But wait, if these names like Judaism and Christianity are just human-made constructs, why does the Quran itself use terms like Yahud and Nasikha? I mean, if they aren't the real names, why validate them by using them in a sacred text?
The Al-Azhar texts explain that the Quran uses these terms to address these groups by the names they had already adopted for themselves. It's basically a tool for engagement.
Ah, I get it.
By calling them Yahud or Nasara, the text is engaging them in direct dialogue. Often it's to critique their current practices or remind them of their original covenants. It recognizes their historical reality so it can talk to them, rather than validating the names as, original divine mandates.
Okay, that makes sense. But changing a title on a cover is one thing. What happens to the pages inside? If the names of the religions were altered or created by humans over time, what happened to the actual texts and the messages given to those original prophets?
This brings us to the science of textual preservation. The sources present a very rigorous Islamic critique of how the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, was preserved, contrasting it really heavily with the preservation of the Quran.
Let's unpack the Islamic methodology first, because honestly, it's incredibly intense. The sources describe a reliance on strict chains of transmission called sanad and continuous mass memorization called mutawatir. But how does a sanad actually work in practice?
So, in Islamic scholarship, a text isn't accepted just because someone wrote it down on an old piece of parchment. You need a sanad, which is a verifiable, unbroken chain of humans who passed it down. Like person A heard it directly from person B, who heard it from person C.
Right.
And to verify this, Islamic scholars developed an entire historical science called ilm al-rijal, or the science of men. They created these massive biographical dictionaries detailing the lives, memories, and characters of hundreds of thousands of narrators.
So they weren't just checking the names on a list, they were basically checking the Yelp reviews of the people passing the message.
That is exactly what they were doing. They would travel across continents just to verify if a narrator was known to have a failing memory in his old age, or if he was known to exaggerate, or even if it was physically possible for person A to have met person B based on where they lived.
Wow.
Yeah, if a narrator was known to lie about just mundane, everyday things, their transmission of a sacred text was rejected entirely.
And then mutawatir means it wasn't just a single highly rated chain of people.
Yeah, right. Mutawatir means it was transmitted by so many people in so many different geographical locations simultaneously that it would be logically and statistically impossible for all of them to have conspired to forge it.
That is rigorous.
It is. The texts highlight that the Quran was written down immediately during the Prophet Muhammad's life and reviewed with him. So you have a combination of immediate written records matching this mass oral memorization.
Now compare that to the critique of the Old Testament in these sources. They point out that it was written over a span of about 1,600 years. I mean, that is a massive timeline full of wars and exiles, and there were huge historical gaps.
Huge gaps, yeah.
The sources mention periods where the Torah was allegedly entirely lost to the Israelites and only rediscovered centuries later by figures like King Josiah.
And from the perspective of these scholars, a lost text that is found centuries later entirely breaks the chain of transmission. There is no sanad. You can't verify who had it during those lost centuries, what they added or removed, or if the discovered text is actually the original.
And for the New Testament, the critique is just as sharp. The sources highlight that authors of some of the Gospels, like Mark and Luke, weren't even original disciples of Jesus. Plus, the texts were written decades after Jesus was gone, and they were written in Greek.
Which is a critical mechanical flaw in the transmission, because Jesus spoke Aramaic. So the foundational texts are Greek translations,
Right.
written by people who didn't necessarily witness the events firsthand decades after the fact.
It essentially sounds like playing a game of historical telephone, spanning thousands of years, bouncing across entirely different language families, with the phone line occasionally just going dead for a few centuries.
That is precisely the mechanical argument the Al-Azhar texts are making.
But let me ask you this. Isn't it a bit anachronistic to judge ancient texts like the Torah or the Gospels using the Islamic science of hadith transmission? That science was invented thousands of years after Moses. It feels a bit like giving someone a speeding ticket based on a speed limit that was invented a century later.
The Islamic scholars counter that argument by separating the formalization of the science from the basic logic of the science.
Okay.
The specific terminology like sanad and mutawatir was formalized later, yes. But the logical requirement for verifying any historical document's authenticity is timeless.
How so?
Well, if you find a document claiming to be a legal contract from your great-grandfather, but there is a 50-year gap where no one knows where the document was or who held it, you logically question its validity in court today.
Right, that makes total sense.
Knowing who wrote a text and who passed it down is a universal necessity for determining historical truth, not just an Islamic one.
The sources also include this fascinating, almost mind-bending detail about texts. There's an Islamic hadith, a documented tradition that describes an argument in the afterlife between the Prophet Adam and the Prophet Moses.
Yeah, in this tradition, Moses basically blames Adam for humanity being cast out of paradise. But Adam replies by pointing out that the Torah, which Moses received, was written 40 years before Adam was even created.
Adam essentially says, "Are you blaming me for a destiny that God decreed and wrote down 40 years before I existed?" I mean, it's a wild philosophical moment.
It really is.
The Azhar sources use this to discuss the concept of divine destiny versus the physical earthly writing of a text. The true divine source of the text exists perfectly in the heavenly realm, but the earthly manifestation is what humans are tasked with preserving, and that's where human error creeps in.
And this rigorous focus on textual preservation has massive real-world implications. Because when a text changes, the consequences aren't just academic.
Right. When a sacred text changes, the laws, the ethics, and the very view of who God is change with it. The sources cite some heavy examples here. They point out that the Old Testament portrays several major prophets committing terrible sins, like adultery, murder, and even falling into idolatry.
And this is fundamentally incompatible with Islamic theology.
So,
In the Islamic view, prophets are handpicked by God to be moral exemplars. They possess a quality called isma, or infallibility, meaning they are protected by God from committing major sins. If a text portrays a prophet as a massive sinner, the Islamic academic view is that the text has been corrupted by human hands, inserting human flaws into divine figures.
they also point out theological contradictions, right?
Mhm.
Like the book of Genesis describing God getting tired after creating the universe and needing to rest on the seventh day. Islamic theology rejects this entirely, viewing God as possessing limitless power, never subject to fatigue or the need for rest.
Exactly. The scholars see these anthropomorphisms, giving God human frailties like exhaustion, as clear evidence of human tampering over those 1,600 years of unverified transmission.
And it extends to the law, too. The sources also critique the Talmud, which represents the practical, lived law of historical Judaism. They claim it contains rulings that historically permitted deceit against non-Jews or commanded the brutal, total eradication of certain populations like the Canaanites. But let me challenge the text's critique here. Ancient history was incredibly violent. Could these harsh laws or these stories of deeply flawed prophets just be a raw reflection of the brutal, realistic, messy times they lived in? Maybe it's not a corruption of the text, but just an honest recording of a harsh ancient reality.
From the source's Islamic perspective, divine revelation has a very specific function. It is meant to elevate humanity above its brutal times, not to reflect the lowest common denominator of ancient human behavior.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a text attributing severe moral failings to God's chosen messengers or commanding unmitigated brutality is the ultimate red flag for them. It suggests that humans, living in those brutal times, inserted their own earthly justifications and flaws into the divine narrative.
That is a heavy, fascinating perspective to unpack. We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started by looking at how these Islamic scholars view the very origins of religion, rejecting the idea of primitive fear and instead tracing it all back to a user manual given to Adam. We explored the deep linguistic roots of Arabic words like deen and Milla, uncovering how they frame faith as a comprehensive system of submission.
We discovered the historical human origins behind the names of major faiths like Judaism and Christianity. And we examine the intense methodological mechanics of how ancient texts were preserved or lost, and how that directly impacts our view of God and ethics today.
If you're wondering why a deep dive into ancient Arabic linguistics and transmission chains matters today, it's because it gives you a massive advantage in comprehending global cultures. When you understand how different traditions view each other's histories and the rigorous frameworks they use to analyze texts, you really start to see the roots of historical conflicts and theological debates in a completely new light. You understand the why behind the beliefs.
It moves you past a superficial understanding and right into the deep architecture of human thought.
We talked a lot about language today, how deen means so much more than just religion. It means a comprehensive system of accounting and submission. If language shapes our reality and the strict preservation of original texts shapes theology, well, what happens when we translate these ancient, meticulously preserved texts into modern languages today?
Does a translated text inherently become a new interpretation?
Exactly. When you take a word as complex as deen and just translate it to the English word religion, you shrink it. You lose the accounting, you lose the obedience. Does every new word choice alter that game of historical telephone just a little bit more? Something for you to think about until next time.